Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us, and welcome to the SPF National Security and Japan-U.S. Program podcast channel. I am Murata, Director of National Security and Japan-U.S. Program at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. Today, we have distinguished American and Japanese guests for our program, Dr. Hal Brands and Mr. Tsuneo Watanabe. He's a senior fellow of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. They discussed today about changing international affairs and American foreign policy abroad. And let me introduce them a little bit in details. And firstly, Dr. Hal Brands. He is the Henry Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS. And he is also a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and an expert on American defense policy, grand strategy, and history. So he came to Japan with our program in 2023, and around the time your book Danger Zone was published in Japanese, so many people are interested in that topic. But since then, you have published multiple books and many articles, so very much look forward to learning many new issues and your thoughts and updates from you, Hal. Welcome back to SPF.
It's great to see you again. Thanks for having me.
And at this episode, we have also a Japanese great guest, Mr. Nabe. His official name is Tsuneo, but we call him Nabe and Watanabe. He is a senior fellow of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. And as many Japanese audience know already, so I should shorten his introduction, but Nabe-san is one of the leading experts on Japan-U.S. relations in Japan and also American foreign policy as well as global security issues in Japan. Currently, he is leading the research project on NATO in the Pacific relations as well. He is also a dentist.
Hello, so I'm very glad to participate in this podcast. Thank you.
Thank you. Nabe-san is a big fan of good friend Yu Hao, and so very much looking forward to the discussion of two of you. So again, today's theme of the podcast is changing international order and American foreign policy. Maybe I would like to ask you how, starting from introducing some new updates, including your new book. The newest book is The Eurasian Century, Hot Wars, Cold Wars, and the Making of the Modern World. Is that correct?
That's right. So it's a new book that is basically trying to put in historical context the challenges that the U.S. and Japan and their allies face in various regions today, from Eastern Europe to the Middle East to East Asia. And essentially the argument is that the modern era, so the 20th century, has seen repeated contests over the balance of power in Eurasia and its key regions, and we're simply living through the latest round of that struggle today.
Sounds very good. Actually, what I'm very much interested in recently is, of course, what direction of the United States after the second Trump administration. But sometimes, guideline is the very short term, what's going on in U.S. domestic politics, but the very, very good guideline is a history, the trajectory of a U.S. strategic position to the world, especially in East Asia. Because, Japan has been the critical actor once Japan fought against the United States over domination of the East Asia. So I think, I'm very much interested in Hal's recent book as a historian. So I'd like to hear some essence, what's going on. Your finding on history and geopolitics in East Asia and Eurasia, including the Russia and Europe, and how it would affect to us, the Japanese Asian, to look at the U.S. trajectory over the grand strategy in the future.
Sure. So I think what's happening today is that the balance of power is under threat in each of the key regions of Eurasia simultaneously. And so the three most important regions of Eurasia have been for a long time Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia, because that's where most of the economic potential, the economic dynamism, the critical resources are located. And if you look at each of those theaters, there are authoritarian actors that are testing the status quo. Obviously, that's Russia with its war in Ukraine and its hybrid campaign against NATO in Europe. We see that with Iran and its proxies in the Middle East. And then, of course, it's North Korea and particularly China in the Western Pacific. And so if you're thinking about those regions collectively, they add up to a significant challenge to the global balance of power. But of course, that challenge is in many ways most profound in East Asia because China is the most capable of the autocratic actors that's out there in the world today. And so that means that the U.S.-Japan relationship is of particular importance in the coming years. Japan has been the centerpiece of the U.S. alliance structure in Asia since the early Cold War. And today, I think it's not much of an exaggeration to say that Japan is probably the most important U.S. ally in the world, simply because if you think about sort of the combination of economic power, technological power, and military power that Japan brings to the table, particularly in East Asia and the Pacific, it can do the most to help the United States advance its own objectives in preserving a stable balance of power in that region. And so the U.S.-Japan relationship has really been evolving quite significantly over the past few years as Japan has reformed its national security and defense policies and become a more engaged and energetic actor, not just in this region, but globally. And that's a trend that I certainly hope will continue in the years to come.
Thank you very much. That's a very, encouraging and also encouraging Japan. But also, I'm wondering how many Japanese are realizing how critical Japan's role in the future in the current moment. I think Japan gradually increased Japan's own defense capability and also the more close cooperation with the United States. But at the same time, Japan has been heavily depends on the U.S. military capability. And Japan's own defense capability is probably the second to the how to cooperate with the United States. And mind setting is also heavily depends on U.S. leadership in the region. However, I think current U.S. move is probably asking Japan or other allied partner to do more and to be more kind of the more I'm not dependent, not totally independent, but I'm doing more by themselves. Is a really kind of a trend. And that's why the Japan increased the defense budget, doubling from now current level to the year 2027 level of 2% of GDP for the defense expenditure. So, yes, Japan is shifting. But perception or is probably not yet. And also Japan also doubting how much U.S. leader is relying on Japan and potentially, anything could happen for especially the Mr. Trump for the dealing with rivals. Maybe Putin, Xi Jinping. Recently, the Mr. Trump said he believes no eternal rival. So Japanese people is wondering, need a kind of some guideline too. How do you think of such kind of anxiety of Japanese? Is that correct?
I think the anxiety is understandable because there's more uncertainty about the future direction of U.S. foreign policy now than there has been at any time in decades. It's undeniable that the U.S. has been encouraging Japan to do more in a military sense and in a variety of other ways, and will continue to urge Japan to do more. The question, though, is whether the U.S. is doing that because it sees Japan as a critical partner and wants Japan to be more of an asset to sustaining the current American-led order in East Asia, or because the United States is considering disengaging from the region and is essentially pushing Japan to look after its own security and other countries to look after their own security in the region. I think the first of those approaches is healthy and constructive, and it's simply a reflection of the fact that the challenge that China poses is so severe that the U.S. and all of its allies are going to have to do more collectively to preserve a congenial environment in this region. If it's the latter, I think it's much more problematic because even if Japan and other countries in the region elevate their efforts and their expenditures on defense, it's not clear to me that there's any coalition that's capable of balancing against China if it doesn't have the active support and engagement of the United States. And so I think that raises the question of sort of which of these scenarios is happening. And I think it's a bit unclear. I think that there is certainly a part of President Trump that just is not interested in security leadership in overseas regions. You know, what he has said about Ukraine, that we shouldn't care about it because it's an ocean away, could just as easily apply to Taiwan or Japan or any other place in the Western Pacific. On the other hand, President Trump's first administration pursued policies that were tough on China, that emphasized modernizing U.S. alliances and partnerships in Asia, and that had some fairly constructive effects. And there is still a fairly strong anti-China consensus in the United States, which means that I think if U.S. policy does change dramatically, Asia is the last place that it will change dramatically. And so it's hard to know where all of this is going over time, but I understand the anxiety that you hear about when you visit Tokyo or other allied capitals in the region, because there's such a clear sense of American ambivalence about regional and global leadership today than there might have been in the past.
And as for the anxiety, it's clearly that we Japanese feel the European allies of the United States has more anxiety than Asian allies. We happened to, I think, host a speech of a Lithuanian defense minister yesterday. And she clearly, the Lithuanian approach is she clearly stress Lithuanians' effort to increase their own military budget. And that day, the happened to be the deployment of Germany for the permanent deployment of troops in Lithuania. That's clearly the European reflection of a European the anxiety to U.S. and do more. I think that's probably less in Asia yet. But how you see this movement, the welcoming?
I think it depends on which countries we're talking about. So just thinking about it broadly regionally, Asian allies of the United States are probably better positioned than European allies in one respect, just in the sense that President Trump has a deep ideological hostility to Europe that just isn't present in his dealings with most U.S. Asian allies. But there are sort of two countervailing factors to keep in mind. The first is that it does vary by country in the Asia Pacific. And so Trump had a good relationship with Japan during his first term. There are indications that he'll have a decent relationship with Japan during his second term. His relationship with South Korea was a bit more fraught during his first term. And it could well be more fraught during his second term as well, depending on the outcome of the election in South Korea next week, and also depending on whether the United States decides, as has been reported, that it will remove a brigade or so of troops from the Korean peninsula. And that could really create a little bit of instability in the alliance. But the other thing to bear in mind is that the Europeans are worse situated in the sense that there is greater hostility from Washington these days. But they're better situated in the sense that, at least theoretically, Europe can balance Russian power without so much involvement by the United States. So, Europe considerably outstrips Russia's economic capabilities. Over time, it could develop the military capabilities to preserve a fairly stable balance of power. It's much harder in the Asia Pacific because the power imbalance is more severe, and the geography makes it much harder to put together a balancing coalition if that coalition is not anchored by the United States. There also just aren't the institutional structures in Asia and the way there are in Europe with the European Union. And so sort of the tenor of Asian relationships with the U.S., particularly Japan's relationship with the U.S., is better than I think is the case in Europe. But there are some factors that make things more challenging as well.
What I was interested in Lithuanian defense minister's the remarks. She really somehow the stressed the importance of Indo-Pacific. Even Lithuania recently they had a strategy for the Indo-Pacific, and they are very much interested in defending Taiwan. That's good trend for us actually, and that's one of the reasons Japan keep supporting Ukraine, because former Prime Minister Kishida says today's Ukraine would be the tomorrow's East Asia. So I think that's probably related to your topics of history, Eurasian power balance, geopolitics, and Japan has been struggling to defend our country from Russia in the history. So the before Japan-Russo war, I think Japan seeking some help from Western powers, and luckily had some alliance with UK. This kind of thing is continue to for the Japan's minding. So, what is the lesson of your analysis of history of geopolitics of Eurasia to Japan's grand strategy in the future?
Well, one of the lessons is that Eurasian stability or instability tends to be an integrated whole, and in the sense that if there is profound instability and it looks like aggression will succeed in one of the key theaters of Eurasia, that can have destabilizing effects on others as well. And former Prime Minister Kishida put that very well when he said that Ukraine today could be East Asia tomorrow. The idea being that successful Russian invasion of Ukraine could make aggression against Taiwan or other countries in the Western Pacific more likely. So one of the encouraging trends of the past 3 or 4 years has been precisely the one that you mentioned, Nabe, which is the formation of increasingly important security ties across the various regions of Eurasia by democratic countries and by like-minded countries. And so Japan, Australia, South Korea have played an important role in supporting Ukraine. You see more and more European countries, France, Netherlands, smaller countries in Eastern Europe and even the Baltic taking a greater interest in preserving peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea. In some cases, their military capabilities are limited, but they can nonetheless do things like help Taiwan with greater societal resilience, things of that nature. And so that's good, because the key advantage that the U.S. has in international affairs is this unparalleled alliance network that spans multiple regions. And to the extent that the strengths of that alliance network can be integrated across regions, they create stronger barriers to aggression. The bad news, unfortunately, is that the bad guys are integrating as well. And so, Russia would not have been able to sustain its war in Ukraine for this long without the economic support that China has provided and the military support that Iran and especially North Korea have provided. And that aid is flowing in both directions. And let me just give you a couple of examples of that. It was really interesting. In April 2024, the Iranian missile and drone strike on Israel looked a lot like Russian missile and drone strikes on Ukraine, right? And so there's clearly a degree of military learning that's happening in these relationships. And the Russians are increasingly selling off some of their most advanced military technology to their partners. And so there are reports that they're helping North Korea with its missile and space launch programs. You've had U.S. intelligence officials say publicly that they worry that Russia might find ways of helping China in a Taiwan crisis. And so, unfortunately, we're seeing closer cooperation between revisionist states as well, and that's making the challenges that they pose considerably worse.
Yeah, you hit another Japanese anxiety that North Korean military is joining the Russian military operation. That's clearly they are learning very much updated the how to fight the war. That's combination of traditional military equipment with new. I think that new means that doesn't have to be the I think technology advanced, but very updated method of how to destroy the enemies, and we really need to prepare too. I think that's the bad news, and the bad guys are getting together. So anyway, that's balancing and power balancing history. So one thing Japanese are really now considering is how to upgrade our own capability, military capability, because unfortunately or fortunately, Japan has never been participating in a serious military operation since the end of World War II. That's critical, unfortunately. Luckily, Japan didn't have to. But now Japan is trying to upgrade our own military capability. However, at the same time, many limitations. Probably political limitation is less than before because the people are realizing. But budgetary, Japan no longer richest nation of the world. So I think the Japan really need to prepare this, and we believe Japan have a need to the Plan A plus. Plan A was just rely on the U.S. and the alliance with the United States, but now it's not enough. So plus is Japan's own capability, and also try to create more networking with other allied partners of the United States. That's South Korea, Australia, potentially India, and European countries too. So I think that's probably the right direction, but it requires a lot of assets. So I'd like to hear your suggestion or recommendation to Japan how to survive in a very ambiguous and unclear international landscape.
I think Japan is on the right track, and a lot of the reforms and initiatives that Japan has undertaken over the past half decade or so make sense regardless of what one thinks about the future direction of the United States. And, there are 2 or 3 ways in which I think Japan can play a really important role in upholding a favorable balance of power in the region. And I think you mentioned at least a couple of them. And so one is trying to turn what was historically a series of mostly bilateral relationships with the United States into more of a regional security network. And whether that will eventually result in something like a Pacific alliance, who knows? But in the near term, Japan is very well poised to just help the United States and other countries develop greater connective tissue between these various relationships through the Quad, through the various trilateral arrangements, through Japan's bilateral relationships with the Philippines and Australia and other countries that you mentioned. And that's more important because the more sort of security web there is, the more resistance there is when China tests the balance of power. The second way is that Japan can often be very effective in engaging countries that the U.S. is less effective in engaging. And so I'm thinking of Southeast Asia in particular, where Japan has long played a very important role. And unfortunately, that's a region where the United States has not been as active or effective as might be desirable. But then the third way just really does have to do with warfighting and military deterrence. And Japan has some very impressive military capabilities, although as you note, they haven't been tested in combat in a long, long time. And it also controls some very critical geography in Northeast Asia. And so one of the the concepts that has gotten a lot of traction in Washington recently is using some of the outermost southwestern islands basically as fire bases to attrit Chinese forces in the Western Pacific, or using Japanese submarines in coordination with American submarines to try to bottle up the Chinese Navy inside the first island chain if a war breaks out. And so those are the sorts of things that I think are going to be more important. And in general, I think that if there is a conflict in the Western Pacific, the United States is going to look to Japan to play a very important role in sort of anchoring the northern part of that theater in the same way that it would look to Australia to anchor the southern end of the theater, while the United States does a lot of heavy lifting in the middle of the theater. But the general point is that deterring or defeating Chinese aggression in the region is increasingly going to be a collective endeavor because the U.S. just no longer has the degree of military overmatch that it once enjoyed.
Thank you very much. That's the great suggestion, and somehow that what Japan is doing, especially the second one. As for the Southeast Asian country, clearly Ishiba administration is really stressing how important our diplomacy with a Southeast Asian country. And as for my experience, recently one of the Southeast Asian countries, the officials visited us for the exchange how to deal with a gray zone challenge in the South China Sea. I think that's clearly, I'm sure Southeast Asian countries inclined to be China because of their frustration against what's going on in Gaza. And also they're somehow frustrated with that Trump tariff. But at the same time, they are not so happy with what China is doing in the South China Sea. So I think that's an opportunity for Japan to do something and connecting with the Southeast Asian countries and also somehow the securing the security in the maritime area. But I think I have another question is the direction of the United States itself, because I read your article, I think 3 years ago, before Trump was elected, and how if Trump is elected, the U.S. would go. And your hypothesis is U.S. has the ability to do alone. That means don't need much about the help from allied partner. So if U.S. pursues their own the going alone policy, I think that's going to be good for a while. But eventually, U.S. will have a big trouble without allied partner and change course. But U.S. and allied partner would lose much more. That's my understanding of your article. So what is your current view on the direction of the United States in the future?
So just to go back to the article you mentioned briefly, Nabe, the argument I made was that it's ironic that the United States has played the leading role in creating and sustaining the existing international order because the United States actually needs that order less than any other country in the world. There is no country that is better situated to thrive in a violent, fragmented world than the United States because of its geographic advantages and because of its power. And so it's actually remarkable and abnormal that the United States has played the role it has in international affairs since 1945. And it simply reflects the memory that during the interwar era, the United States basically pursued a version of this policy and eventually discovered that bad things will reach you, even in the Western Hemisphere. And so it was that lesson that really underpinned the American foreign policy of the post-1945 era. But that was 80 years ago. And so the historical memory of the events that made it so necessary for the United States to play that role has faded. And in some ways, sort of the purest version of President Trump's worldview holds that the United States just doesn't need to do so much of this anymore, that it doesn't need to have primary responsibility for underpinning an open global economy, that it doesn't need to play such a leading role in providing security in regions that are so far away from the United States. And so the article I wrote wasn't so much a prediction of what would happen if Trump became president. It was trying to explain why the U.S. role in the world periodically comes under criticism from within the United States, and what would happen if the United States were to withdraw from international affairs. So will the United States withdraw from international affairs? I think the answer is no, at least over the period of the next 3.5 years, so the remainder of the Trump administration. I think Trump himself is ambivalent about U.S. alliances. He doesn't like the burdens that they impose on the United States, but he loves the fact that those alliances mean that the leaders of France and the UK and Japan and South Korea have to be super nice to him when they come to Washington and ask him for favors, and that's the sort of leverage that he likes. So I would actually be quite surprised if the U.S. were to formally withdraw from its key alliances. I do think, however, that the lesson that the Trump administration is teaching the world, intentionally or unintentionally, is that it is dangerous to be so dependent on the United States, because a lot of what the Trump administration has done in its first 4 months is to try to weaponize that dependence by imposing very high tariffs on countries that rely on access to the U.S. Market and things of that nature. And so I expect that U.S. alliances will endure, but I think countries around the world, particularly in Europe, but also in East Asia, are not going to want to be as dependent on the United States as they have been in the past. And whether that is a good thing or a bad thing depends on how far that process goes, and it depends on how U.S. foreign policy evolves over the next 10 to 20 years. I can see one scenario where it brings about sort of a healthier situation because U.S. allies in Europe and Asia feel that they need to do more in their own defense, even as they hang on to the relationship with the United States. I can see another scenario where if this continues over the next 2 or 3 presidencies, those relationships end up being broken to a more significant degree, and that would obviously be more of a challenge.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That your elaboration is really helpful for the lessons you're talking about, the learn from Trump administration. I think especially for Japan. I think Japan has been a divided opinion in the past to some pro-alliance group either heavily depends on the U.S. and we secure our own independence with alliance with the United States. And the other part is now shrinking, but in the old days, a big power was anti-alliance, and we are too much dependent on the United States, and we are losing our independence. I think both sides has some good point, but probably both sides are not so good for the Japan's direction. Probably Japan really need to the more independent capability, but at the same time allied with United States. This kind of thing that we, as already I told you, the Plan A plus. Plan A is not enough, but I don't think Plan B or C is good. So Plan A plus is the way to survive, and we survive means our own survival and stability in the region. And probably would be good for the U.S. would be the more comfortable with getting alliance together. So I think that's gonna be our direction. Clearly, you already suggested what Japan and other allied partners should do, and what I'm also somehow the confident is history, as you suggested. I think geopolitics history, balance of power between the powers in the past, especially the 21st century. I think it was irony. It was Japan who really broke the U.S. inward-looking America first after World War One. Without Pearl Harbor, I don't think U.S. participating in the world politics is a little bit slower. I don't know how Admiral Yamamoto or Japanese leader understand their role. My interpretation is they didn't realize it. Anyway, the Franklin Roosevelt was very wise to utilize somehow the helping China and anti-Japan things. It was kind of a balance of power. And now, ironically, Japan's role could be China or not. But unfortunately, nowadays, major power has a nuclear. So we cannot do similar game in the century. So we should be more careful. So I believe a lesson learned. So my question, last question, maybe the timing too. So the concluding your whole view of history, or anything you would like to add to the what you have talked.
Let me add 2 points just in response to your last set of comments. The first one, I think you made a really important point, which is that whether it is stabilizing or destabilizing for countries in Europe and East Asia to do much more in their own defense really does depend heavily on whether they're doing it in partnership with the United States or not. And so U.S. alliance commitments have always had two purposes, one of which gets talked about a lot and the other one doesn't get talked about as much. The one that gets talked about a lot is to deter aggression by bad actors against the regions that the U.S. cares about. The one that doesn't get mentioned as much is that those alliances are meant to suppress and limit historical tensions among U.S. allies. And so one of the key roles of NATO was to make it possible for France and West Germany to reconcile after World War II. One of the key roles of the U.S. alliance system in Asia was to make it possible for Japan to be reintegrated back into the region and be allowed to thrive economically after the Second World War. And so if we think about a world where the U.S. withdraws from Europe and Asia and countries in those regions feel like they have to do dramatically more to defend themselves by building up their militaries, perhaps acquiring nuclear weapons in the case of Poland or South Korea or other countries, you have the possibility of just sort of a much nastier world returning where some of the rivalries that have been suppressed for the last 80 years come back in fuller force. And so that's the first point. The second point, you mentioned the nuclear issue, and I think the nuclear issue is incredibly important and is likely to prove incredibly challenging in the years ahead for two reasons. The first is that we're entering a world that has never existed before, where the United States is going to face nuclear peer challengers in Russia and China at the same time. So you'll have a tripolar nuclear environment. And for detailed and specific reasons, that's a very challenging environment for deterrence and stability. The second reason it's challenging is I worry a lot that one lesson that Xi Jinping might have learned from the Ukraine war is that the U.S. will be incredibly hesitant to fight against a nuclear-armed great power. And so if we ever do see more Chinese aggression or coercion against Taiwan, I would not be at all surprised if that is accompanied by nuclear threats that are meant to prevent the United States, deter the United States from intervening in that conflict. And so that's a challenge the U.S. and its allies are going to have to think about as well. And we've already seen, if you look at the nuclear debate in South Korea, there's growing concern over the stability of U.S. extended deterrence in the region. And so I think that's going to be an issue that America and its allies have to grapple with seriously in the years ahead.
Thank you, Harold. That was a great insight. And clearly, the Japanese side also realized so-called stability, instability, the paradox is happening too. That's easier for the Russia and China somehow discount the U.S. involvement because they are worried about a nuclear exchange between major powers. So I think that timing, we, Sasakawa Peace Foundation also, I think the reporting a new recommendation for the how to secure our extended deterrence too. So everybody is watching seriously. That's maybe good things, good aspect of a very bad reality too. So again, I appreciated your great insights, and I think I'm turned to the MC. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I was actually going to ask you about the nuclear issue when I was listening to the discussion, and at the end, it came up. And of course, we can continue to discuss about this issue maybe only for an hour or so, but then that would be the next time. And I really appreciate, as Nabe-san said, we are going to host a webinar on the extended deterrence under the Japan-U.S. alliance on next Monday. And so this is very interesting topic and very critical and difficult issues now in Japan as well. So really appreciate that you two mentioned and discussed about that too. Thank you very much. That was very interesting and very fruitful discussion and touching upon many important issues. So, the final question to Hal on: do you have any like a new plan of the book or writings, articles, or projects we should wait for in coming months or years?
A couple of things that might be worth mentioning. So I write a weekly column for Bloomberg Opinion on various aspects of global affairs, and so that's always a good place to sort of keep up with my work. I also have an edited book that is coming out in 2 weeks, so it'll be out on June 10th, and it was written by a group of 17 or 18 mostly American scholars taking stock of the U.S.-China competition over the past decade and thinking about where it's going in the future. And so that book is called Lessons from the New Cold War, and it will be out in the middle of June.
Well, thank you very much. That sounds also very interesting. And so once it will be published, we may come back to you asking you to introduce and discussing other aspects in that book as well. Again, and thank you very much for today and joining us. And I really hope to have you two and maybe with another guest again in the future at this podcast channel. Thank you very much for today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.